Okay, time now to turn our attention to the international newspapers. Laurent Bersteker is with us for that. Laurent, we're going to start with a tour of the Iranian papers, which is, of course, focused on the killing of Qassem Soleimani and the possible consequences for the region and the country. No secret that any conflict involving Iran would have consequences around that area.
Well, of course, it's been a very emotional weekend in Iran, a lot of conflicting emotions running in the country right now, sadness, anger, and fear. And that's something we can see when looking at various Iranian papers, starting with Iranian daily Khorasan, which headlines on this massive procession to honor Soleimani, which was attended by millions of mourners across the country. The paper calls it his last pilgrimage. It was the biggest such procession in Iran for 30 years, which goes to show the popularity of this general. Now, English-speaking Iranian daily, the Tehran Times, also published an opinion piece saying Soleimani was a culture and culture cannot be assassinated, cannot be killed. It argues that the general represented an ideology and a mindset of resistance against U.S. imperialism, and that killing him is effectively making him a martyr, and that will only reinforce those sentiments for many Iranians. Now, the Tehran Times also had a front page, a very worrying front page, where we can see Hassan Nasrallah, the head of the Lebanese Hezbollah, in the quote, "Go home or sent in coffins," loosely translated. That was his message to the U.S. Following the killing of Soleimani. And, well, he warned of retaliation against U.S. troops in the region.
Indeed, we are, seeing hundreds of thousands of mourners turn out in Tehran again right now, in fact, part of the funeral. But also we've seen mourners take to the streets of Beirut. Give us an idea. We've looked at the Iranian press. What are other countries like Lebanon, Israel saying about it?
Well, I mean, those are countries that are closely affected by what's going on in Iran, and we can see a lot of worry in the Lebanese press, for instance, with Soleimani's killing and the declarations by Hassan Nasrallah that we just mentioned. But there's a sense, according to L'Orient Le Jour, that Lebanon could avoid getting directly involved in an armed conflict, even if that was to come about. It's arguing that while Nasrallah wants to avenge Soleimani, he doesn't want to involve Lebanon, and he emphasized the need not to target American civilians, only U.S. troops, none of which are stationed in Lebanon. So that's an indication that he hopes to leave the country out of it. And now moving on to Israel, another country closely connected to all these events, we can see the Jerusalem Post headlining on Iran's pledge of unlimited uranium enrichment following the strike. Now, a sign that, of course, there's a lot of worry in Israel regarding this possible nuclear program by Iran. And the Times of Israel was also published an interesting article on Donald Trump's threat to strike at Iranian cultural sites. Now, the author reminds us that this is actually a war crime, and that would actually represent, according to the author, a new low even for the Trump administration.
Indeed, and yet Donald Trump doubling down on that threat as he arrived back into Washington from his holidays in Florida. But let's move on, Laurent, to Venezuela, and there the National Assembly has voted for a new speaker, but in very unusual circumstances.
Well, the last thing we can say is that in Venezuela, like everything, this was a very controversial vote. And so far, there's no real consensus as to the outcome. The event is described very differently depending on which papers you look at. And let's start by looking at a Venezuelan online outlet called Venezuela Analysis, which says that opposition leader Juan Guaido was replaced as parliament head in this disputed vote. We can see Guaido trying to get in parliament to get over a fence. Now, the article does note that Guaido did not cast his vote, did not enter parliament, but says it's not clear whether he was prevented to do so or did it of his own accord. Now, looking at the Washington Post, the story is quite different. Well, the article by the Washington Post is decrying the fall of Venezuela's last democratic institution as Maduro attempts a takeover. The article argues that it says that Guaido and other opposition lawmakers were prevented by security forces from casting their vote, and that other lawmakers were actually bribed weeks in advance to vote against Guaido in what the author calls a carefully planned parliamentary coup. Now, another U.S. news outlet, Politico, gives us kind of the middle version and says the sidelining of Guaido means U.S. plans for Venezuela are hit turbulence as Maduro tries this takeover. Juan Guaido was the man supported by the U.S., recognized by the U.S., but the author argues that U.S. policy is unlikely to change in Venezuela following this setback, and that the Trump administration is likely to push its allies to ramp up the pressure on Maduro.
So many questions remain unanswered on that Venezuelan story. We're going to have to leave it there for now, Lauren Bershtaker, with the review of the papers.